Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I am so proud to welcome Sendible as our sponsor. Sendible is the social media management platform that I personally prefer to handle all of our storytelling online. Sendible has generously offered you, an ardent Business of Story listener, an incredible 30% discount on their traction plan. It's normally $99 a month, but if you use my link, you can get it for just $69 a month. So visit sendible.com/park30 to start your free 30-day trial today.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Do you know that feeling when you buy into something exciting and you're just certain what you're buying into will provide the best outcome for you and your family? But what if the teller of that story is simply using proven myth structures to almost magically have you embrace something, a product, a service, or even a political point of view that is actually not in your best interest, and sometimes diametrically opposed to helping you succeed, yet you're still all in? It sounds like it can't possibly happen, does it? But your decision-making is constantly under siege by brands, people, and politicians who pull your strings using primal story structures of myth every single day. How do you know when you're being played and how you can use these same techniques for good and not evil with your purpose-driven brand storytelling? Well, today we have an Irish expert who will share the difference between red and blue rhetoric and what powerful myths we seemingly can't resist. Sandy Dunlop runs a global branding consultancy called Alexander Dunlop Ltd. He is an expert on brand building and cultural research and helps brands do what he calls world making, using myth, archetype, symbol, and all that goes into creating iconic brands. He works with some of the world's largest companies such as Unilever, Danone, Miller Brewing Company, Coca-Cola, and Nestle. He's got a number of different side projects that he's very passionate about, one called Bard Mythologies. Bard is currently running Myths We Live By in the Perse Museum and offers a series of events under the heading Myth and Modernity. In 1997, Sandy published Business Heroes, which uses mythology and storytelling as a model for corporate innovation and change. His latest book is called The Rebirth of Brand, based on 20 years of looking at advertising history reels and identifying the core of iconic brands. The book is currently being shared in a really interesting way. He's doing it as a long-form campaign on LinkedIn, and it will ultimately be published later this year. But this is precisely where I found Sandy, was on LinkedIn when I read his article last week called Trump's 5 Cultural Myths. For me, it answers the question of how Trump can wield so much power, especially when it flies in the face of reality, to get reasonable people to act irrationally. If you want to learn how to use myth to drive the positive growth and impact of your purpose-driven brand, then this episode is for you. In addition to Sandy's world building for brands, he is a board member of Green Foundation Ireland. He helped run the Climate Alliance and the Low Carbon Alliance. He also has led the Terranir, I'm not sure I said that right, Terranir Better Energy Project and the Terranir College Rugby 2020 project that helped transform the fortunes of the club with 10,000 hours of committed volunteer time. So please welcome brand mythologist Sandy Dunlop to the Business of Story. Sandy, welcome to the Business of Story, coming to us all the way from Dublin, Ireland. Great to have you here.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure, Park, and thank you very much. And you're right, I am speaking from Dublin, Ireland. It's a country and a place and a city that has a great reputation for storytelling and myth-making, and I think with good reason. But thank you very much. I really appreciate being on your excellent podcast.
Well, thank you for that. I know, we had Dr. James McCabe here on show number 226, and he is a fellow storyteller from Dublin, and that was just a couple weeks ago. We covered there the difference between rhetoric versus narrative or spin versus story. And today we're going to talk a little bit about red and blue rhetoric and how you see that. But before we do that, I want to just let my listeners know how this came across. I was on LinkedIn last week, and a very timely article you wrote, Trump's 5 Cultural Myths, and started reading through that because so many of the questions we have to ourselves here in America is how can so many people buy into the Trumpian way when it just appears to be not in their best interest in any way, shape, or form, and yet they are just maniacal about this guy. You hear him as the cult president now, and it's a really, really fascinating look at the power of narrative and mythology and how he wields it to build his base, to dismantle the Constitution, to really trigger and encourage other leaders to do the same thing around the world, creating nationalism. And when you just take a step back, you look at it and think, how could one person be so dynamic in this area and so effective when, as you take a further step back, you look at it and it just seems like buffoonery, craziness. He doesn't come across as the sharpest tool in the shed, yet he is extraordinarily effective. So your article in LinkedIn and your 2 videos talking about this, absolutely fascinating to me, and I wanted to bring it to our listeners because this show is not about whether you believe in Donald Trump or not. This is an observation about how one individual, almost clownishly, can have the kind of pull and intrigue that Donald Trump represents. So with that, before we jump into the 5 myths, Sandy, you've been building and working with brands around the world. Can you give us a little bit about your backstory and how you bring this approach of mythology and archetyping and building rituals around creating brands? When did this start working in your life and you realized you want to create a career out of it?
Well, yeah, I grew up in India and my parents were from Scotland, and I was sent back to a boarding school in England. And so I guess if you that kind of nomadic background, you kind of wonder, where do you fit? And my parents then moved to live in Ireland. And I have to say, I always found myself more at home in Ireland. And then I just found myself, I don't really know why, just fascinated with myth and storytelling, and just started to read and just found that Ireland had an absolutely extraordinary mythic tradition. But in relation to its application to branding, I used to work with a Cambridge, Massachusetts company called Synectics that used to be part of Arthur D. Little. And we used to do a lot of creativity and brainstorming. The company was called Synectics. And I got working with a lot of the Unilever, a huge global fast-moving consumer goods company with, at the time, 1,800 brands. And I was facilitating global and regional strategy sessions, but I got to know a lot of the marketing directors. And one day, we'd been doing a project on who it was that was responsible for really big innovations in Unilever, not just one SharePoint gain in the fabric wash category or ice cream, but 6 or 7%. And when I went round talking to those people, was that invariably, well, almost inevitably, there was a character there who, behind these really great innovations, who'd been paddling a canoe in a contrary direction and had found it very difficult because they were before their time, and typically they had been pushing for a direction and found that the organization wasn't very receptive at the time. And so they would get a lot of grief, and typically they would end up either leaving or being fired or sometimes staying on and being quite cynical. Because one of the problems with an innovator is they're ahead of their time. But that got me into myth, and I did a couple of university courses on ancient Athens and the mythic foundations of Western culture, and I did another one on world religions. And I was in Hamburg one day with one of my clients who'd been the marketing director of Unilever in the Philippines, and now she was back in Hamburg running 5 European brands. And the business model in Unilever was build a functionally better product and then use your marketing, typically claim and demo marketing, to tell the consumer why this product was better than any other. Now, if that's the case, you don't really need marketing because you have a story, and typically if it's a really good product, it sells by word of mouth. So your typical features and functions or features and benefits marketing. Exactly, and USPs and all that. And a very commoditized approach to marketing. You're just trying to say that we function better than the next competitor, therefore buy us. Exactly. And I mean, if you do, and if you've got patents on whatever you do, it actually makes it easy. And Unilever built a great global business doing that and then exporting their products around the world and mastering fast-moving consumer goods manufacturing, go able to get it out. And they did a brilliant job. But Jackie's problem is she had 5 Unilever brands and absolutely nothing to say about them. There was no functional difference. So can you share what those brands were, or some of them? Well, they were in personal wash and skin. So they were brands like Lux and Timotei. I don't know how well they'd be known in Dove was one. And Dove actually did have a little bit of functional difference, but the rest didn't. They were soap and personal wash and skin brands and hair brands, and they just had nothing functionally to say. So if you're running a European business and 5 brands and your business model is empty, they spend $1 billion a year on R&D, and they had absolutely nothing to say, nothing to put in the soap, nothing much to put in the shampoo that was of any relevance. So I said to Jackie, well, why don't you consider using these great archetypal characters that I'd got to know? And my wife's a Jungian anyway, so I knew them. She was a psychotherapist at the time. And you're talking about archetypes like Carl Jung's archetypes to try to start building personality around these brands and creating more meaning for what they stand for? Well, yeah, I think the archetypes of Jung are all right as a starter. And people like Carol Pearson have popularized that. But I was actually wanting to take it a little bit deeper into the actual characters in the myths themselves. And Jackie had done Spanish and French literature at university, so she intuitively, spontaneously, and immediately said, yeah, let's go for it. And she found a nice bit of money, which she had in a budget, and 2 months later, a gang of us headed off to Hamburg to work on 5 Unilever brands. And we were really off as a business. And the other thing I'd said was, you may not be familiar as to who Aphrodite or Circe or Achilles are, or you may only have a passing knowledge, but don't worry, because the world's films are full of these characters, and we can show you film clips to illustrate them. And so that's exactly what we did. And what I didn't really realize at the time was that it was a fundamentally different starting point, because instead of beginning with what the product is and how it works, which was at the core of functional and product marketing at the time, you were actually switching to another fundamentally different question, which was why the product is. And if you only know why if you know who you are. So the fundamental question then is, who are you as a brand? And that's essentially a very different starting point. And that's really how the business started. And we've really been doing that ever since, with global brands all around the world. And then what you realize is these archetypes are a universal language. And my classics team at the time did two projects. One was on who is Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, or who is Demeter, the Earth Mother, in other cultures. And then they formed a global team and found out that in India, Demeter, the Earth Mother, is Mahalakshmi, and everyone in India knows exactly who she is. And the other thing we did is a project for Polygram looking at mythic structures in best-selling films. And as well as the hero's journey, we found that the best-selling films over the last 60 years had followed the structure of 6 Greek myths. In other words, there are emotional mythic pathways that are evident in those cultural productions, films, that are most successful in putting bums on seats in the entertainment business.
And what's fascinating, Sandy, about this is when you're talking about the Greek gods and Aphrodite and so forth and these myths, essentially they are all fictions, right? They're just imagined realities that we storytelling apes can buy into. And yet they are extraordinarily powerful if a brand does it right and does it for the right reasons to create, would you say a subconscious identity? I mean, an identity in our consumer subconscious that for some reason, these myths are already coded algorithms in our storytelling brain that says, oh, I can identify with that, because we are all buying into these same myths.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the issue is that the word myth, it has a bad name.
Yeah, like a falsity, right? Like it's not true; it's just a myth.
Yeah, in common usage, the term myth is a lie or an untruth, and in a way, the rational enlightenment of the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, would have been part in the marginalizing and, in a way, framing, myth as being the opposite of reason and the opposite of the rational.
Mm-hmm.
And they would call myth as a disease of mind. And clearly people who had a Christian agenda also described them as pagan stories, even though particularly the Old Testament uses mythic forms and mythic structures all the time. But the term myth had a bad name. What's happened in the 20th century is it's been rehabilitated, and I think with very good reason, because a myth is actually an articulation in another narrative form of our deepest longings and desires. And the thing about those is, if you ask someone what they need, they'll tell you, for example, I'm hungry. But what they do not know is what their deepest longings are and their deepest desires are. And what a mythology is an articulation in narrative of our deepest longings and our deepest desires. And you will not get to longings through sitting in a focus group, because people do not know what their longings are until they see it in someone else, which is why films and films based on myths are so powerful, because you look at an expression of an archetypal energy in a film and you say, I want that. I want to be James Bond or Saoirse Ronan or whoever your hero or heroine is, and you want what they want as well. That's the deepest longings. And the point is exactly as you said, these things are unconscious. And so what we have seen is the most iconic brands, effectively what we did for 20 years was look at advertising history reels. The Unilever folk or the Diageo folk or the Miller Brewing or Helene Curtis would give us their advertising history reels. And you'd find that there was typically 95% of the advertising was instantly forgettable. It was just boring. But every now and again, you'd come to something and you'd say, wow, that is extraordinary. And then you'd find that the consumers remembered some ad from 20 years ago and they couldn't remember what was shot the last 5 years. They had no idea. And so what we've been doing, and what my book, Rebirth of Brand, is about these iconic brands communications that enter a culture. And what you find is that they, a bit like best-selling films, they have an uncanny predisposition, or they just use these mythic archetypal structures. And then when you look at the advertising history reel, you say, that was brilliant. Why didn't you carry on with that? Because the next campaign goes back to the old way. And in a way, it goes back to what you were talking about in the James McCabe, which is the difference between rhetoric and story. And in the language I thought was useful is that I call what most people who are educated at university or beyond, they're initiated and educated in a form of thought that is predicated on a belief that if you string a series of facts together on a series of assumptions that reach a particular conclusion, that people will be persuaded by that. But one of the things that's increasingly evident from the neuroscientists and the cultural and moral psychologists and decision science is that isn't how it works. That in situations of where people are having to make decisions in areas of great complexity, great uncertainty, and too much information, they use simplifying heuristic devices to help them make the decision. And those heuristics, and they're used in politics, and that's what we might be talking about in a minute, is how Donald Trump used it. Those heuristics make huge use of metaphor and archetype and myth, because they are the cultural reference systems that work in this intuitive, instinctive decision-making. Kahneman calls it System 1 and System 2.
Right. And I mean, really, if you want to really simplify it, it's logic versus emotion. That the logic of facts and assumptions don't sell, but emotion does. And so they use heuristics to connect with feelings of people and these embedded, ingrained archetypes of stories and myths and so forth to, like I said earlier, I guess, these algorithms that they're just simply trying to connect into to get your brain go, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking about or feeling about.
Well, that's right. And the thing you've got that it's worth bearing in mind is each culture has its own body of mythic, folkloric, historic stories that pretty much everyone in the culture knows. And we call that the cultural mythographics. And it is a compendium of stories that are typically told even before you can read and write. You know, pretty much everyone's heard of Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood and The Wizard of Oz. And they're typically the stories through which you learn to read and write. And if you've got kids, you'll probably remember that when you're reading to them, they want the same story told over and over again. You kind of think, do you not want a new story? And the kid doesn't. They want the same story told by their mother over and over again. Or they like watching the same Disney movie over and over again. And what that then means is that there must be an emotional satisfaction in the familiar repetitive story. So what that means is you have an emotional hardwiring of a culture which is built around the shared compendium of stories, the cultural mythographics. And that is what is the basis for the communications of iconic brand. And the people that use it, I call that approach red rhetoric, because it has, in fact, it isn't rhetoric, and it's similar to what you were talking about with James. It's the difference between rhetoric and story. Red rhetoric is actually red engagements. It's rhetoric that doesn't use rhetoric in a way. It uses an emotional empathetic engagement. And the ones that are most powerful in communications are the ones that use those mythic forms that are familiar to everyone in the culture. And that is what your 45th president is absolutely brilliant at. He's a master red rhetorician.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So, Sandy, so you look back on Trump and you look at all of his unbelievable business failings, one business model after another going, south, him leaving vendors, partners holding the bag. The one thing he hit out of the ballpark was simply the mythology of the Trump name. And he made his money selling his name, putting it on buildings that other people were carrying all the risk on, and he was making the money on it. So it's not surprising then, when you look back, on one hand, you go, it's surprising that he would land the highest, throne in the land as a president of the United States of America. But it comes back to looking at how he has used narrative his entire life, basically selling smoke and mirrors. I mean, just what he built meaning around the Trump name, and he built meaning around him getting elected president. Many people argue he didn't even think himself he was going to get elected. I don't know about that, but let's jump into and talk about these 5 cultural myths that you've identified in this article that you see. And I like it too, because you're seeing it from outside of America. So in some ways, I feel like you have maybe a clearer vision of what in the world is happening here. But let's talk about your article here and how he's used it and continues to use it to fire up his base and potentially get reelected in 2020.
Yeah, well, as I say, he was a master red rhetorician, and Hillary and the Dems were totally into blue rhetoric. And they now, what are the myths? One of the first is the most popular story in the world is poor boy makes good.
Okay, real quick, Sandy, though, let's clarify. Red rhetoric, you were saying, is almost not rhetoric. It's storytelling. It's tapping into these myths. Blue rhetoric is what? Logic driven. Let me tell you what my platform is, the facts and the figures, and look at how smart we are and we can overcome this.
Yeah, it's policy-based argument, and it's arguing, and it's talking about healthcare and foreign policy and all those sort of things. And well, let's get into how Trump did it. First of all, I think he had a brilliant training because he was the star-stroke producer of the Apprentice series. And that is built on probably the most common story in the world, which is poor boy makes good. And what he was essentially saying is this series is about giving ordinary people the opportunity to end up in a Trump Tower and a Trump helicopter and Trump this and Trump that. And so it's an extraordinarily powerful myth. And in a way, Obama sold that. He was a better red rhetorician, and his story was from Kenya to the White House in a generation. And that is a hugely powerful mythic structure in America. It's the structure of Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, Pretty Woman is poor girl meets Richard Gere, and Titanic is poor boy meets rich girl. So it is arguably the most popular story. The Bollywood films of India are just full of it. So there's one mythic structure he used, poor boy makes good. And it was about the apprentice. And he actually would have been, in a way, schooled in what drives ratings, because he'd have been watching them every week. Because if the ratings of the apprentice went down, they'd stop the show. So he learned an awful lot in that, in how to drive ratings of mass audiences. One of the things, I've watched the series, is I think he learned, a bit like Game of Thrones, cruelty works, because some of his calls are actually cruel. He keeps someone on that you really think, you've got to get rid of this guy. He's just making a fool of himself. But Donald kept him on for 2 more episodes because I think he thought, if I keep this on, this guy will bring another 1 million people to watch. So I think he learned, like Game of Thrones, cruelty drives ratings. But anyway, what are the other 4 myths? One of the most common myths in America is the cowboy story. And just to give you an indication, in the 1960s, there was a study done that between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock, midweek at peak viewing hours, there were 16 hours of cowboy films shown every year. Every week. 16
hours. Well, I mean, the cowboy film really is all American, isn't it? Cowboys and Indians. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. And if you look at the structure of the cowboy, Homesteader in Trouble, if you think of a film like Shane or even Star Wars, Homesteader in Trouble, trouble beyond the capability of the homesteader, there's not really recourse to law and order, need strong man with gun. Strong man with gun, not expected to be nice man. They do not care about the moral qualities of the man with the gun. They simply, in the context of the fear that they're under, want a problem solved. So strong man come in with gun, do the dirty work, a bit like Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, and leave. So if you have been successful in creating a culture of fear, and by the way, where I first learned this is we were right part of Unilever's fastest growing brand in the fastest growing category in Unilever for the decade, the noughties. And it was a toilet cleaner brand called Domestos. And the brand film was Big Dom. It quite explicitly evoked the Western in its music and its imagery and its anthropomorphized bottle. And the message was, there's a gunslinger coming into your toilet. And the implication was, because people are so familiar with the plots, they'll fill in the gaps, there's a baddie in your toilet. And by the way, your loved ones are threatened. So whatever your daughter's name is, whether it's Sharon or Susie, Susie's threatened. And you need Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry to come into your toilet and blow the brains out of the germs. And that got huge hike in Domestos. And we went back to that. It's Hercules, it's Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry. So the point is, it's inducing fear. Most people don't walk into their toilet feeling frightened. But this branding did, by evoking a film, a genre that's all about fear. So there's one structure.
So you're thinking then with Trump in here, I like the analogy to your toilet cleaner. He comes in, I say, I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm here for you. And people can look the other way because what you quite often hear here in America is, how can people buy into this? Or he doesn't even look like he represents their ideals and their beliefs and their values, or maybe their beliefs, but not necessarily their values. And they're willing, what you're saying is Americans, his base, are willing to look the other way while he goes in and does the dirty work on their behalf.
Exactly. Because the point is, in the context of the fear that he's induced, and by the way, it fits with another myth, which is mob at the gates.
Okay, let's hold on to that one for a second. I just want to cover the Cowboy Strongman one just a little bit further. And maybe these all play to this. So when he shows up and he says, I'm going to bring back coal and coal mining jobs, which all you have to do is look at the market and the industry and realize that that's not going to happen. You know, coal is going the way of the bison and renewables will eventually take over. And yet the coal mining folks believe he's in their best interest. He's going to put more money in their pocket. Well, he does with a little tax break, but then he goes on and gives tax breaks to the riches. He runs our debt through the roof, which goes against every conservative policy of the Republicans, and yet they blindly go along with them or spinelessly go along with them. So these myths, from what you're telling me, are so powerful that we will buy into that fiction even at the expense of the reality of how it's going to truly impact us, with fewer coal jobs, less money in our own accounts because we know that the trickle-down theory doesn't work. We're going to turn a blind eye to the 1%ers that are getting the tax breaks. And then this economic disparity is just going to keep growing, which is the one thing more so than anything may tear America apart. So what you're saying is we have a tendency as Homo sapiens storytelling apes to buy in to myth, which are fictions in and of themselves, which maybe is why they are given, myth has been a bad name, and that's not true. But we are willing to buy into mythology or these archetypes that feel right to us, even though if we stood back, took a deep enough breath and looked at it and realized this is actually not in our best interest.
But what you're talking about, a lot of your critiques are blue rhetoric applied to a red rhetoric storyteller. Mm-hmm. So all the stuff about trickle down and this is going the way of the bison is a rational thought that isn't of relevance, because the modern equivalent of the Riker family in Shane or Darth Vader in Star Wars is my steel factory has disappeared. My small town is gutted because the coal mines closed down. And so it's a modern equivalent of a wasteland or a destruction. So, and to call it a myth, it doesn't feel like a myth because it feels narratively credible to the person who's in the circumstance of which they're frightened. So art imitates life. He's told stories that are sufficiently narratively credible to people that they don't care about the subtle distinctions. They are frightened. And in the context of frightened, you're frightened for your life, you're frightened for your livelihood.
It's an emotion.
A myth is as real, it's narrative. It has total narrative credence. It's not myth as lie, it's myth as truth. So he's absolutely speaking to their inner world, their fears, and he's offering a way out that only he will solve the problem. And by the way, it is connected to the one I did mention there, which is Mob at the Gates, because the Mob at the Gates story is a very commonly one used by people like him. And in his particular case, he kicks off with the Mexicans. Well, we've seen that before in the Alamo. Mm-hmm. There's some aggregated others that are threatening you. And so he's got a brilliant ability to connect with the inner emotional fears, and he heightens them. And so he's basically doing, and by the way, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson did it in Brexit by suggesting that 70 million Turks were about to invade Britain. That really was a fiction. But the point is, to the people listening to the narrative, if it credibly explains their inner world, they don't care about narrative truth. So the myth is not a fiction in their inner world. It's entirely believable, provided it's got a narrative coherence and credence. So the mixture or the combination of Mob at the Gates, which is this aggregated other that he presents, all Mexicans are rapists, and in a way puts that together with the cowboy structure. And you've got a homesteaders in Boise, Idaho, or Racine, Wisconsin, who feel that their homestead is under threat. And they know this structure. It's completely familiar with those cowboy films that they've watched, and it's familiar with Star Wars. So really, whether it's narratively true or factually true is irrelevant. It has a narrative credence.
It lands for them. There's a coherence in their life that they can relate to it.
Yes, exactly. And it fits the cultural mythographics. The other one he uses is the Moses story.
Okay, let's hold on to the Moses story for just a second, because I know we have two more that we want to cover. But before we do that, Sandy, I want to throw to our good friends at Sendable, because they help make this program happen. And if you as listeners out there are trying to share your story online and really make it connect, Sendable's a platform. So let's go to that. And when we come back from their message, we'll cover the next two myths that Donald Trump has used to rule the Trump world right after this. Many of you have been following me in the business of story on social media for a while now, and I really appreciate it. And if you're not, I hope you will. We share valuable business storytelling tips to help your brand stand out among the awful noise out there. And we do it all thanks to Sendable, a social media management platform that helps over 3,000 digital agencies worldwide to work with their clients, breathe life into their brands, and get their stories heard on social media. What we like about Sendable is they make it super easy to manage your content and your stories online. They allow you to source content from clients and collaborate closely with them to create a social media strategy built on true and proven storytelling principles. You can reliably plan and schedule content to be automatically published to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and more. And you can demonstrate the impact that this content has had on your audience growth and conversion by reaching out through their in-depth reporting and analytics. There's much, much, much more that you can do. But you know what? I think maybe my favorite feature has to be Smart Posts functionality. Now, what Smart Posts are is it makes it incredibly easy to craft social media content and in one single step, customize it for each platform, giving you the best chance of driving engagement and getting people to pay attention to your content. Sendable truly makes managing so many channels an absolute breeze. I know, you have a lot of choices when it comes to social media management apps, so I wanted to let you know we here at the Business of Story can't recommend Sendable enough. Gavin and his team are so great that they have a special offer just for you. You can now get, as a special offer for Business of Story listeners, Sendable's Traction Plan for only $69 a month. That's a 30% savings. So sign up now at sendable.com/Park30. Believe me, your stories will take off. Welcome back to the show. Park Howell here with Sandy Dunlop. We are talking mythology in branding, in archetyping, and especially how Donald Trump has used it to not only land the highest seat in the land, but potentially to get reelected in 2020 beyond most people's beliefs. So we're talking about beliefs here in mythology and how that works. What is the next area? We've talked so far about the Cowboy Strong man. We talked about hordes at the gates, rags to riches.
Mob at the gates. Poor boy makes good.
Poor boy makes good, which is the same as rags to riches, or is that a different mythology?
Exactly. That's exactly rags to riches. Yeah.
Okay.
That's rags to riches. And as I said, Obama uses it. The next one is the Moses story. And if you recall the story, the Israelites are under all manner of oppression and government regulation and unfair taxes. And Moses leads them out of that oppression to the promised land with divine assistance. The Israelites had God on their side, and they were the chosen people. So in the campaign, he used to say, particularly when he was fighting the Republican primaries, Jeb Bush is no Moses. The implication was that he, Donald, was Moses. And the oppression was all manner of democratic government regulations, the Environment Protection Authority, financial regulations, which were put in because of the 2008 crash, all those sort of things. These oppressive regulations and this oppressive tax regime that is paying for unfair taxes to give welfare to immigrants and other unworthy users. I, Donald, will lead you out of the oppression of the Egyptian, not Egyptians.
the Democratic oppressors, yes.
Yeah.
The socialists, the communists.
The socialists,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So that would have been another one. And he's done he's done exactly what he said he would. He put in lobbyists to run the EPA. He's now, the other day I see he's unpicking the healthy food that Michelle Obama put in because probably some lobbyist is telling him something. But the final one is rot at the top. And that is essentially the narrative structure of the series.
Drain the Swamp, right?
It's Drain the Swamp. It's House of Cards. It's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's deeply rooted in American history because essentially they escaped the rot at the top in Europe and set off to create an alternative republic. And so that's where Drain the Swamp is all about. So what we have then is 5 foundational myths: the cowboy, Moses, poor boy makes good, rags to riches, rot at the top, and mob at the gates. And to be honest, he's absolutely masterful in tapping into the anger and fears of a disaffected working class who feel left behind by the prosperity. And he found their anger and he found their fears, and he offered himself as the strong man's solution. And it had nothing to do with reason. It had an awful lot to do with the intuitive, instinctual heuristics that people use to make decisions under pressure in areas of complexity that they do not understand, and that's in the voting booth. And meanwhile, the Dems were wheeling out people like Pete Buttigieg, who's Harvard and brilliant and all that, and all these socialists. They're incredibly worthy people, but they don't use red rhetoric, because the only way, I mean, on another occasion, what we could look at, if it's of interest to you, is 2 things, Park. One is he also brilliantly uses oral storytelling techniques. And the second is, how do you counter a masterful red rhetorician? And one of the things we'll know, if you look at my book, which I'm publishing on LinkedIn, a campaign called Rebirth of Brand, what Thunder 2, by the way, it's based on Finnegan's Wake's 10 Thunders. Thunder 2 is people feel before they think, and you cannot change feelings with facts. So there is no point in arguing with the Donald with Blue Rhetoric facts. You cannot change feelings with facts. The only way you can change feelings is with a better story. And so far, I do not see even the slightest attempt on behalf of the Democrats to articulate a better story. So if you felt inclined, we could maybe have another chat.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to cover here. Would definitely love to have you back on the show. I've got one final question for you for this particular show that's really focused on myth and how brands can use them. So while we looked at how Trump has used them, it's just such a interesting case study on how to use it. So our listeners here, you can apply these same sort of principles and storytelling tactics to your purpose-driven brand and use them for good and not evil. My question for you, Sandy, is from the outside looking in, do you think that Donald Trump is so smart and so well-versed in the classics that he consciously sat down and mapped out this approach, or do you think he is just intuitive? And for whatever reason, maybe it's his reality TV show training or all the BS he spun his whole life as he built and destroyed companies. Is it just intuitive? Is this just a guy that gets it and he doesn't even know why he gets it?
Well, that's a very good question. I somewhat jokingly say in my Rebirth of Brand is that the classics department of Harvard ought to give him Donald Trump an honorary fellowship, because he seems to have applied pretty much all the implications of everything that's in 20th century classical scholarship, where they were trying to understand the oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as oral compositions. So I do think, if we had time on another occasion, I do think understanding orality, because I think we're in a secondary oral world, I don't think there's the slightest chance he's read Eric Havelock's brilliant insights as to this switch from oral to written. I do think that being a star on The Apprentice gave him a huge understanding as to what drives mass audiences. He lived it for 10 years, and that show was pretty successful.
And the irony, of course, of that is a quote-unquote reality TV show, which we all know there's absolutely no reality to it. It's all fabricated. A reality TV show calling everything fake news. Well, the dude was a fake reality TV star, which made him that TV star.
I think that comes to something I think you were raising with James McCabe the other day. What's the difference between spin and storytelling? I did listen to your podcast. I thought it was excellent by you and James, but it got cut off towards the end before you got onto spin and storytelling. But I would say what spin is the other person's stories. So I think we look at Trump's storytelling and say this is a modern form of propaganda. It's spin. But I think he would look at, to the extent that the Democrats do storytelling, which isn't very evident, and say that's fake news, because his term for spin is fake news. So anything that doesn't agree with his worldview, he describes as spin. And we look at his stuff and say, you're lying, Donald, that's spin. So I don't know what you and James decided spin and storytelling were, but that would be my take on it. Spin is the other person's story.
Very interesting. Sandy, when is your book coming out?
Well, I tell you what I'm doing is I thought I would put it out on LinkedIn, because I basically have been quite skeptical about digital. I think there's a whole load of people enchanted with it, and it promises all these measures and metrics, and it's a delight for someone who's an accountant. But to be honest, I think it's quite good as a fulfillment means. If you know what you want, it's a good vehicle to search. But I don't think it's any good at all in terms of creating longing. There's still no substitute for a brilliant 30-second or 60-second commercial. And I think a lot of digital advertising is just incredibly irritating. And I think a like is not a longing. A like doesn't mean I'm going to do anything. And I've been given for the last 2 years some incredible, fantastic statistics about likes and downloads and all this. And frankly, very little of it amounts to anything. And so I think that, okay, there are problems with TV advertising, but why I wrote A Rebirth of Brand is I think there's still, I think we're not going through a good era of great branding. And I just wanted to fight for, maybe I'm an ostrich sticking my head in the sand, but I think most of digital is overblown. And
yet you're going to release your book on the digital platform of LinkedIn.
Yeah, I am. I'm releasing it over. Yeah, you're right. There's an irony. But to be honest, I wanted to find out how it works. Yeah. And there are some strange benefits, but there's also, I mean, it's a benefit. You picked this up, and who knows, it might benefit you and me, and you wouldn't have got it if it wasn't for LinkedIn.
Right.
But
when will your book be out?
I think the end of the year. I mean, essentially what it's going to do is to be available. I've already got, it's organized into 10 thunders, because essentially I don't think marketers are very good at explaining how marketing works. And there are much better explanations in neuroscience and folklore and mythology and classical studies and semiotics and even world religions. So I've got 10 thunders, which is actually what Finnegan's Wake, which you mentioned with James McCabe, is about. I've got 10 thunders. The first thunder, which comes actually from decision science or from marketing science, is the most effective advertising doesn't try to persuade. Now, if that isn't something to think about, what is? because everyone thinks marketing's about persuasion. But Thunder One says the most effective advertising does not try to persuade. It creates a longing that you cannot stop thinking about. And the second one is based on neuroscience, and it says people feel before they think, and you can't change feelings with facts. So those two, in those two phrases, there's enough in those to effectively turn a lot of marketing rhetoric, which is what it is, upside down. And what I do think is that there's still, actually, when you told me your story, Park, about, that led to setting up Business of Story, I think you were finding that a lot of digital stuff was questionable. For example, Pepsi switched entirely in 2010 to a digital campaign. They stopped doing TV advertising. At the end of the year, their market share was down 4%. And
digital is just so sporadic that I don't know how you can knit together a cohesive story, mythology, whatever. I mean, even playing off the myths that you talked about here in a congruent way, because you're going to do one thing on Facebook, something different on LinkedIn, something different on Instagram. To me, they're just more like spitting out content and messages. In fact, I say if content is king, then storytelling is the kingdom's sorcerer, because that's where the magic really happens. But you need a little bit longer form to make that happen. It can't just be. I
think that's where the work we do in Alexander Dunlop is you've got to know your archetype, you've got to know your mythic structure. Otherwise, consumer involvement and multiple channels can lead you to a total bloody mess where you don't know who your brand is. So if you don't know what your archetype is, you don't know what your mythic structure is, and you have consumers participating and telling you what it is, and you have multiple channels and 6 different agencies running those various channels,
then
you are going to have a monumental mess. And I was a judge on a big online campaign of a big multinational in telco, and it was patently clear they hadn't a clue who they were. That's why we create a brand dossier which brings to life. I see great brands as being world makers. You've got to have a coherence and the kind of rules that someone, for example, George Martin's Game of Thrones, they had rules and narratives and archetypes that follow rules. And I think that needs to be the discipline. But if you don't know those, online, interactive, immersive marketing, multiple agencies, the danger is it's a bloody mess, and it does nothing to increase the longings you need to drive fast-moving consumer goods and win political elections.
I want to leave this then on the thought of transforming likes into longings, because I think that's ultimately what brands want to do. The like doesn't buy you anything, but if you can build that longing in your customer to come and work with you and do it for good and not evil, then you're going to be ahead of the pack.
Absolutely. That's spot on. From likes to longings. And I do think brands can play a huge role for good.
I do too. I mean, that's the whole business about the Business of Story, is helping purpose-driven brands that are in this world to have a much greater positive impact than just the bottom line. So,
we see the point about myth has been used to divide and evoke nastiness and racism. The 3 most effective myth makers were the German Führer, your 45th president, and Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson in the UK. So myths can be used and abused. Yeah. And I, if we had time, I'd go into some examples where some of the great American brands have played a huge healing role, because what I see is myths are being used to divide, and the danger is your country's going to, or maybe it's already there, in a cultural civil war. So without healing, and I think brands can play a huge role, the danger is Civil War again.
Yeah.
You repeat that again. You're going that way at the moment.
Well, Sandy, with that, I will definitely have you back because I want to talk and explore some, more of these other areas. It's just so fascinating to me and hopefully to our listeners out there. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, and congratulations on your excellent... I'm glad you've left advertising agency world.
Well, thank you for that.
Okay. If it's on LinkedIn, just... check out Sandy Dunlop. And then if you want to check out Thunders 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm just doing Trump at the moment, which is why you picked it up. Look up alexanderdunlop.blog or just the www.alexanderdunlop, and then there's a blog. So there's a lot of posts, a lot of ads, a lot of articles. Periodically, I get into debates with other gurus. Just join up and follow and send in your own stories and send in your own ads. And let's see if we can have branding be used to create a saner world, because it's pretty crazy at the moment.
I think we can do that. Sandy, thank you so much for being here. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, super. And thank you, Park. Brilliant. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you like what you heard, by all means, share this with friends, family, colleagues, bosses, your brands, your clients. There's a lot of power in mythology and the work that Sandy's talking about. I've seen it now in the interviewing of 240 different story artists here on Business of Story over the last 5 years. And it keeps coming back to this fundamental thing of our brains are hardwired for story. You hear that. It's even almost becoming trite because people use it so often, but it's true. So using these techniques in mythology and storytelling and story structure, it literally will help you hack through the noise and hook the hearts of your customers. Because as Sandy said, we buy with our feelings, we buy with our hearts, no matter what is being sold to us, and then we justify that purchase with our heads. That's why story is the single most powerful vehicle you can use to grow your purpose-driven brand. And of course, if I can help you in that area, visit me over at businessofstory.com and feel free to go on iTunes. Let us know what you think of the show. And of course, come on back next Monday when we're going to have another amazing story artist right here for you, like Sandy Dunlop. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.